There are words that leave the room the moment they are spoken, and there are words that stay for years. You may know this better than anyone. Some words were said to you in anger, and although the voice that spoke them has long gone quiet, the sound still returns when life becomes still. Some words were spoken across a kitchen table, over a phone call, in a hospital hallway, beside a closed door, or in the middle of a family argument that no one ever truly repaired. Maybe someone judged you before they understood you. Maybe someone accused you when you were already tired. Maybe someone you loved used your weakness against you. And what hurt most was not only what they said, but who said it. And perhaps there are other words too. Words you said, words you wish you could gather back into your hands. Words spoken too quickly, too sharply, too fearfully. Words that came from pain before prayer could soften them. Words that wounded someone else or revealed a part of your heart you did not want anyone to see. Maybe you have replayed them many times. Maybe you have asked God to forgive you, yet the memory still rises with a quiet sting. This is the strange power of the tongue. It can open a door or close one. It can bless a child or burden a child for years. It can restore a broken heart or make a lonely heart feel even more alone. It can speak courage over someone who is weak, or shame over someone who was already trembling. A sentence may last only a few seconds, but the soul can carry it for a lifetime. And when you have been hurt by words, silence becomes complicated. Sometimes silence feels like wisdom. Sometimes it feels like fear. Sometimes it feels holy. Sometimes it feels like surrender. Sometimes it feels like being erased. You may have wondered when God wanted you to stay quiet and trust Him, and when He wanted you to speak the truth with courage. You may have wondered if keeping silent meant you were weak, or if speaking up meant you were unloving. You may have wondered why Jesus sometimes answered with truth so clear it shook the world, and other times stood silent while people lied about Him. That question is not small. It reaches into family pain, church wounds, betrayal, regret, marriage, friendship, aging, loneliness, and the quiet ache of being misunderstood. It reaches into the heart of a tired believer who has swallowed too much pain for too long. It reaches into the soul of someone who has defended themselves so many times that they are weary of talking. It reaches into the conscience of someone who has spoken from anger and now longs to speak from peace. There is a kind of silence that comes from fear, but there is another silence that comes from trust. There is a kind of speech that comes from pride, but there is another speech that comes from love. And only the Lord can teach the difference. Long before your heart carried these questions, Jesus walked through them. He knew what it meant to be misunderstood. He knew what it meant to have His words twisted by people who did not want truth, only accusation. He knew what it meant to be betrayed by a kiss, judged by a crowd, questioned by rulers, mocked by soldiers, and abandoned by friends. Yet He never lost the holiness of His voice. He never used words the way wounded people often use them, to punish, to prove, to crush, to win. And He never used silence the way fearful people often use it, to hide from obedience, to protect comfort, or to avoid love's costly demand. His silence was holy because it rested in the Father. His words were holy because they carried the Father's heart. In Him, silence was not weakness, it was surrender. In Him, speech was not noise, it was life. He could stand quietly before false accusers, yet speak forgiveness from the cross. He could refuse to answer the proud, yet call a grieving woman by name in a garden. He could remain silent before those who wanted to condemn Him, yet speak peace into a locked room full of frightened disciples. He could look upon Peter after denial without a word, and later restore him beside the sea, with questions gentle enough to heal what shame had broken. This is why we must follow him slowly, not as students collecting rules, but as wounded people watching the Savior walk through the very pain that has marked us. We must enter the night with him. We must listen to the silence before the storm. We must stand in the garden where prayer becomes surrender. We must watch betrayal approach with torches. We must sit beside Peter by the fire and feel the terrible weight of words spoken in fear. We must stand near the cross and hear words that did not sound like revenge, but like mercy. We must wait through the silence of the tomb and then hear the risen Christ speak a name in the morning. Because the answer is not simply, speak less, and it is not simply, speak up. The answer is deeper, holier, more healing than that. The answer is to let Christ heal the place from which your words are born. A bitter heart can speak Bible verses and still wound people. A fearful heart can stay silent and call it wisdom. A proud heart can speak truth without love. A wounded heart can turn every conversation into a courtroom, but a heart touched by Jesus begins to learn another way. It learns that not every accusation deserves an answer. Not every battle requires a defense. Not every truth should be spoken in anger. Not every silence is obedience, and not every trembling voice is weak. There are moments when God calls his people to be still and let him defend what no human argument can fix. There are moments when the wisest answer is prayer, patience, and quiet trust. There are moments when speaking too soon would only deepen the wound, harden the room, or feed the fire. But there are also moments when silence becomes fear dressed as peace. There are moments when love must speak, when truth must protect the vulnerable, when forgiveness must be offered, when hope must be given, when a broken person needs to hear, you are not beyond the mercy of God. If you have been wounded by words, Christ understands. If you regret words you have spoken, Christ can restore you. If you have been silent too long, he can give you courage. If you have spoken too quickly, he can give you wisdom. If your voice has been shaped by pain, he can reshape it with grace. The story begins in a quiet place, not in a courtroom, not before a crowd, not beneath the cross, but in a garden under the weight of night. Before Jesus stood silent before men, he spoke honestly to his Father. Before he faced accusation, he entered surrender. Before the world heard the words that would change eternity, heaven heard the prayer of the Son. And so, to understand when silence becomes holy, we must walk into Gethsemane, into the darkness beneath the olive trees, where Jesus chose surrender before he ever answered his accusers. The garden was quiet, but it was not peaceful. Gethsemane lay beneath the shadow of the Mount of Olives, where ancient trees twisted upward like hands that had learned to pray through centuries of wind. The night air was cool. The city behind them still carried the restless breath of Passover. But here, among the dark branches and the silver edges of moonlight, the noise of Jerusalem seemed far away. Jesus had walked this path before. His disciples knew the place. They had followed him through crowds, storms, questions, miracles, meals, arguments, and wonder. But this night felt different. The darkness did not only cover the garden, it seemed to press upon it. Jesus brought Peter, James, and John farther in with him, the same Peter who had spoken with such confidence, the same Peter who had said he would never fall away, even if everyone else did. His words had sounded brave when the table was warm and the Master was near. But the garden has a way of revealing what a room cannot. A promise can sound strong before fear arrives. A voice can sound steady before the hour of testing. Peter did not yet know how fragile his own courage would become before morning. Jesus did know. He knew the road before him. He knew betrayal was already moving through the night. He knew the kiss, the torches, the false witnesses, the courtyard fire, the soldiers, the nails, the cross. He knew the loneliness that was coming. And yet he did not run from the Father's will. He stepped into the garden and let his sorrow become prayer. He told the disciples that his soul was deeply grieved, even to the point of death. There was no performance in his honesty, no polished religious phrase, no pretending that obedience did not hurt. The Son of God, holy and without sin, allowed his closest friends to see the weight he carried. Then he went a little farther, fell on his face, and prayed. There, in the hidden place, before he answered his accusers, before he stood before priests and rulers, before he spoke from the cross, Jesus spoke to the Father. His first response to suffering was not an argument with men. It was surrender before God. He did not begin by explaining himself to those who would soon misunderstand him. He began by pouring his anguish into the only hand strong enough to hold it. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, he prayed. The words were not rebellion, they were intimacy. They were the language of a son who trusted the Father enough to tell him the truth. There is a holy kind of honesty that does not resist God, but brings trembling into his presence. Jesus did not hide the weight of the cup. He did not pretend the suffering ahead was small. He named the sorrow, and then he surrendered it. Yet not as I will, but as you will. This is where holy silence is born. Not in denial, not in fear, not in swallowing pain until the heart becomes hard. Holy silence begins when the soul has already spoken honestly to God. Many people stay quiet because they are afraid. Jesus stayed quiet because he was surrendered. Many people avoid speaking because they do not know what to do with their pain. Jesus brought his pain to the Father until his silence before men became an act of trust. The disciples slept nearby. Their eyes grew heavy. Their bodies were tired from the meal, the road, the hour. Jesus returned and found them sleeping, and he spoke to Peter with sorrowful tenderness. Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Who had promised loyalty could not stay awake in the hour of prayer. The failure had begun before the denial, not because Peter did not love Jesus, but because he did not yet understand that human confidence cannot stand where prayer has been neglected. Jesus warned them to watch and pray, that they might not enter into temptation. The spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. It was not a cruel statement. It was mercy spoken before failure. Jesus knew the weakness of his friends, and still he loved them. He knew they would scatter, and still he brought them near. He knew Peter would deny him, and still he prayed within reach of him. The garden teaches something tender to every wounded heart. Before you answer the person who misunderstood you, pray. Before you send the message written from pain, pray. Before you defend yourself to those who have already decided what they believe, pray. Before silence turns into bitterness, pray. Before speech turns into fire, pray. The Father can receive what people cannot handle. He can hear the words too raw for a conversation. He can hold the grief beneath your anger, the fear beneath your defensiveness, the wound beneath your need to be right. Jesus prayed again and again. The same sorrow returned, and the same surrender answered it. This was not a quick moment of spiritual strength. It was an agony pressed through prayer until obedience became the path beneath his feet. The garden was not merely a place where Jesus felt sorrow. It was the place where sorrow was placed into the will of the Father. Every time he returned to prayer, he laid down again the right to escape. the right to be understood, the right to defend himself by power, the right to avoid the pain that love had chosen to bear. Somewhere beyond the trees, footsteps were coming, the low murmur of men, the metal sound of weapons, the flicker of torches moving through the darkness. Betrayal was not an idea anymore. It had become a procession. And still Jesus rose from prayer with a steadiness that did not come from the garden, but from the Father. He woke his disciples. The hour had come. The Son of Man was being betrayed into the hands of sinners. No frantic speech came from him. No desperate attempt to gather sympathy. No speech of revenge against Judas before Judas arrived. Jesus had already fought the first battle in prayer, and because of that, he could meet the next one with authority wrapped in peace. The garden remained under moonlight. The olive trees stood silent. The disciples stirred, confused and afraid. Peter's hand would soon reach for a sword. Judas would soon step close enough to kiss the face of the one who had washed feet and broken bread. The night would soon fill with torches, voices, and the terrible nearness of betrayal. But before betrayal touched him, surrender had already held him. And while Jesus prayed in surrender, betrayal was already walking toward him with torches in the dark. The torches appeared first, small flames trembling between the trees, moving through the darkness like a warning. The garden that had held prayer now filled with footsteps. The quiet branches of Gethsemane, which only moments before had watched the sorrow of the sun, now watched the arrival of betrayal. Men came carrying weapons, lanterns, and the cold confidence of a crowd that believed numbers could make wrong look righteous. Their shadows stretched over the ground. Their voices broke the stillness. The night no longer felt hidden, it felt hunted, and at the front of them was Judas, not a stranger, not an enemy from far away, not someone who had only heard rumors of Jesus and misunderstood him from a distance. Judas had walked with him, eaten with him, heard his teaching, seen his miracles, felt the dust of the same roads, sat near the same fires, received bread from his hand, and now he came close, with the sign of friendship on his face and betrayal in his heart. There is a wound that only someone close can give. A stranger can hurt you, but a trusted person can break something deeper. When betrayal comes through a familiar voice, when pain arrives through someone who once knew your table, your confidence, your kindness, your prayers, it cuts differently. It leaves questions that are hard to quiet. How could they? Why did they? Was any of it real? Did they ever love me? Did they know what this would do to my heart? Jesus knew that kind of pain. He did not meet betrayal as an untouched observer. He received it into his own story. Judas stepped near, and with a kiss he gave Jesus over. "Rabbi," he said, and the kiss landed on the face of the one who had never stopped loving him. Jesus did not flinch into hatred. He did not answer betrayal with rage. He did not expose Judas with a long speech before the crowd. He did not defend his wounded heart the way any of us might have wanted to. He simply met the moment with a sorrowful truth. "Friend, do what you came to do." Another gospel remembers his question like a blade wrapped in grief. "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" A question, not a scream. Truth, not revenge. Jesus named the betrayal without becoming like the betrayer. He did not pretend the kiss was innocent. He did not deny the evil of what was happening. But even here, even in the garden lit by torches and treachery, his words did not become poison. Then everything moved quickly. The soldiers came forward. The disciples woke fully into fear. The stillness shattered. Peter, who had slept when Jesus asked him to watch, now moved with sudden fire. His hand reached for a sword. The same man who could not remain awake in prayer now tried to prove loyalty with steel. In one desperate motion, he struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. It was the kind of reaction pain often produces. Fast, hot, certain. The body moves before the soul has listened. The mouth speaks before prayer has shaped the words. The hand reaches for a weapon because fear cannot bear to feel helpless. Peter loved Jesus, but love mixed with fear can become dangerous when it refuses the way of surrender. For a moment, the garden held the sound of violence, a cry, a flash of metal, a wounded man stumbling back. The disciples may have thought the fight had finally begun. Perhaps Peter believed he had done something brave, something necessary, something that proved the promise he had made. But Jesus stopped him. "Put your sword back into its place," he said. There was authority in his voice, but not panic. There was correction, but not cruelty. Jesus would not let Peter defend him in a way that contradicted him. He would not let the kingdom of God be mistaken for the kingdoms of men. He would not let a fearful disciple turn holy loyalty into harm. Then Jesus did something almost impossible to imagine in the middle of his own arrest. He touched the wounded servant and healed him. The man had come with those who seized Jesus. He was part of the company that arrived to take him away. He had stood among the threat, among the weapons, among the machinery of injustice. Yet Jesus, betrayed and surrounded, paused to heal the wound caused by the friend who tried to defend him. This is the heart of Christ. Even when he is wronged, he does not stop being the healer. Even when he is betrayed, he does not let his followers become destroyers in his name. Even when the night is full of injustice, his mercy remains pure. The servant's ear, torn by Peter's fear, was restored by Jesus' compassion. And in that act, the Lord revealed something about the kind of voice he wanted Peter to have one day. Not a voice that cuts, not a voice that proves love through violence, not a voice that reacts before prayer, a healed voice, a shepherd's voice, a voice that would one day feed sheep instead of striking enemies. But Peter was not there yet, and perhaps you understand Peter more than you wish you did. Perhaps you know what it feels like to react from fear, to speak from pain, to defend someone or something you love in a way that leaves another wound behind. Maybe you have said things that felt justified in the moment, only to feel the ache of them later. Maybe you have used words like a sword because silence felt unbearable. Maybe you have cut with truth because your heart was not healed enough to carry truth gently. Jesus did not hate Peter for this, but he did stop him. Love sometimes stops us before our fear turns into destruction. Mercy sometimes interrupts us before we confuse reaction with courage. The Lord knows that not every impulse to speak is obedience. Not every urge to defend is wisdom. Not every wound gives us permission to wound back. Then Jesus turned to the crowd and spoke to the strange injustice of the hour. Day after day he had sat teaching in the temple, and they had not seized him. But now they came with swords and clubs, as though he were a criminal hiding in the dark. Even then, his words were not frantic. He named the truth, he acknowledged the moment, and he surrendered to the scriptures being fulfilled. The disciples could not bear it. The fear they had not prayed through now overtook them. One by one, they fled into the night, leaving Jesus standing alone among his captors. The garden that had held his closest friends now became the place where he was abandoned by them. The torchlight moved. The soldiers bound him. Judas had kissed him. Peter had struck for him. The others had run from him. And Jesus, the only truly innocent one, gave himself into the hands of men who did not understand that they were leading the Lamb of God toward the salvation of the world. The olive trees watched as he was taken away. Behind him lay the place of surrender. Before him waited accusation, mockery, judgment, and the cross. But he did not walk as a victim of chaos. He walked as the Son who had already said yes to the Father. Betrayal had touched him, but it had not ruled him. Violence had risen around him, but it had not shaped him. Fear had scattered his friends, but it had not entered his heart as master. From the garden, Jesus was led into rooms where lies would be spoken loudly, and truth would stand quietly. They brought Jesus into the house of the high priest, while the night was still thick over Jerusalem. The city did not know what it was holding. Behind closed walls, beneath torchlight and religious robes, men gathered to judge the one through whom all things were made. The room was cold with certainty. Faces leaned forward from the shadows. Voices rose before truth was invited to speak. They had not come looking for understanding. They had come looking for a reason. Jesus stood in the center, bound but not broken, silent but not empty. Around him, men spoke as though noise could make falsehood holy. Witnesses came forward, but their stories did not agree. Words twisted, memories were bent into weapons. Fragments of his teaching were pulled from their mercy and made to sound like threat. The one who had healed the sick, touched lepers, welcomed sinners, raised the dead, and spoken of the Father's love was now surrounded by people trying to turn goodness into guilt. There is a pain in being misunderstood by those who never wanted to understand. It is one thing to be questioned by someone seeking truth. It is another to be examined by people who already decided the verdict before you entered the room. In such moments, every answer can be turned against you. Every explanation can be cut apart. Every honest word can be used as another stone. The heart longs to speak, to set the record straight, to say, that is not what I meant. That is not who I am. That is not what happened. But some rooms are not built for truth. They are built for accusation. Jesus knew the difference. He did not answer every lie. He did not chase every twisted phrase through the chamber. He did not beg the hostile to become fair. He did not hand his peace to men who only wanted ammunition. He stood like a lamb before the shearers, fulfilling what the prophet had seen long before, oppressed and afflicted, yet not opening his mouth in the way the world expected. His silence was not emptiness, it was obedience. His quietness was not defeat, it was trust. The high priest listened as witness after witness failed to make the accusation stand cleanly. Still, the desire to condemn remained. The room wanted an answer it could use. And finally, the high priest rose, pressing through the noise with a question meant to force the moment. Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? Jesus remained silent. In that silence, heaven was not absent. In that silence, the Father was not confused. In that silence, the truth did not die because men refused to honor it. The eternal Word stood among human words and did not need to defend his worth before those who hated the light. There are times when silence is the only way to keep your soul from entering the same spirit as your accusers. There are times when answering every charge would pull you into a battle God never asked you to fight. There are times when the Lord sees what has been twisted, and your task is not to win the room, but to remain faithful before Him. Jesus shows that holy silence can be a sanctuary around the heart, a refusal to let bitterness shape the tongue, a quiet surrender of reputation into the hands of the Father. But his silence was not permanent. When the high priest asked him under oath if he was the Christ, the Son of God, Jesus answered, not with panic, not with self-defense, not to soothe their anger. He spoke because truth required it. "You have said so," he declared. And then he pointed beyond the room, beyond the torches, beyond the temporary authority of the men before him. They would see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. It was not the answer of a man trying to survive. It was the answer of a king who knew his throne was not threatened by a courtroom. He had stayed silent before lies, but he spoke when the truth of who he was had to be revealed. That is the difference between speech born from wounded pride and speech born from holy witness. One tries to protect the self, the other bears witness to God. The room erupted. The high priest tore his robes. Men called it blasphemy. The verdict they had wanted was now in their hands. They spat in his face. They struck him. They mocked him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" The cruelty of mockery is that it tries to make suffering feel small. It tries to turn pain into entertainment. It tries to strip dignity from the one who is already wounded. Jesus, blindfolded and struck, became the target of words designed to humiliate. Yet he did not return insult for insult. He did not use divine power to silence them. He did not call down angels to prove what their hardened hearts refused to see. He bore it, not because their words were true, but because love had chosen the road to the cross. Not because he had no power, but because his power was surrendered to redemption. The silence of Jesus in that chamber was not the silence of someone who had lost control. It was the silence of someone who had given himself fully to the Father's will. And perhaps somewhere in your own story there has been a chamber like that. A place where people spoke about you, not to you. A place where your intentions were judged, your words twisted, your past used against you, your heart unseen. Maybe you tried to explain, but the more you spoke, the more exhausted you became. Maybe you learned that some people do not want your answer. They want your reaction. Maybe you discovered that the desire to be understood can become a prison when you place it in the hands of those committed to misunderstanding you. Jesus stands with you there. He does not tell you that false accusation does not hurt. It hurt him. He does not tell you that mockery is harmless. He bore its shame. He does not tell you that being misunderstood is easy. He carried it into his own flesh. But he shows you that your soul does not have to be ruled by the room that judged you. Your identity does not have to depend on the people who misread you. Your peace does not have to be surrendered to every accusation. The Father saw Jesus in that room. The Father knew the truth when men lied. The Father honored the Son when men mocked him. And if you belong to Christ, the Father sees you too. He knows what was said. He knows what was false. He knows what you meant. He knows what others did not care to know. He can hold your reputation better than your fear can defend it. The torches burned low. The night moved toward morning. Inside the chamber, Jesus stood beneath the weight of false witness. But outside, in the courtyard, another fire was burning, and beside it, a disciple who had promised loyalty was about to discover the terrible power of words spoken in fear. Outside that chamber, another voice was beginning to tremble, the voice of Peter, who had promised more than his fear could carry. Outside, the courtyard fire burned against the cold. Its light moved over faces that did not know they were standing at the edge of a soul's breaking. Servants and officers gathered near the flames, warming their hands, speaking in low voices, waiting for the night to finish what it had begun. Above them, inside the house, Jesus stood before accusers. Below, in the open air, Peter stood close enough to feel the heat of the fire, but far enough from Jesus to feel the chill of fear. He had followed at a distance. Those words carry a sorrow all their own. Peter had not run as far as the others. Something in him still loved too fiercely to disappear completely. He wanted to know what would happen. He wanted to stay near, but he did not have the courage to stand beside Jesus openly. So he followed where many wounded believers have followed before him. Not fully gone, but not fully close. Near enough to watch, far enough to hide. Only hours earlier Peter's voice had been strong. Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. The words had sounded like devotion, and perhaps they were devotion in part. Peter did love Jesus. His heart was not empty. His failure did not mean his love had never been real, but love untested can sound braver than it is, and confidence that has not been humbled by prayer can collapse under pressure. By the fire, someone looked at him. A servant girl, perhaps glancing from the flames to his face, recognized something about him. The accent, the nervous stillness, the way he watched the door. She said he had been with Jesus. A simple sentence, a small accusation, not a sword, not a Roman whip, not a council of priests, just a voice in a courtyard. But fear does not measure danger accurately when the heart is already shaken. Peter answered quickly, too quickly. I do not know what you mean. The words left his mouth and entered the night. The first denial did not come with thunder. It came like many failures come, almost suddenly, almost instinctively, wrapped in self-protection. He moved away, perhaps toward the gateway, perhaps trying to create space between himself and the question. But fear followed him. Another person saw him and said he was one of them. Again Peter denied it, this time with more force. I do not know the men. I do not know the men. The sentence was short, but it carried the weight of a broken promise. Peter knew him. He had known the sound of Jesus' footsteps on the road. He had known the warmth of his hand pulling him from the sea. He had known the authority in his voice when storms became still. He had seen bread multiply in his hands. Demons flee at his word, the dead rise at his call. He had confessed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and now, beneath the pressure of fear, he said he did not know him. There are moments when people speak from pain and hardly recognize themselves afterward. A sentence can come from the mouth before the soul has caught up with it. Fear can make a person deny what love knows is true. Shame can make the tongue protect the body while wounding the heart. Peter's words did not reveal that he had never loved Jesus. They revealed that fear had found an unhealed place in him and spoken through it. The night stretched on. The fire kept burning. The faces kept watching. The house still held Jesus, and Peter still stood in the dangerous space between loyalty and survival. After a little while, others came near. They were more certain now. His speech gave him away. He was a Galilean. He belonged with Jesus. The pressure tightened around him, and Peter's fear rose into something desperate. He began to call down curses and swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. That sound cut through the courtyard like a blade of morning before dawn had arrived. It passed over the fire, over the servants, over the stone walls, over Peter's shaking heart. And in that instant memory returned, not gently, not slowly. It came with the force of truth. Before the rooster crows, Jesus had said, "You will deny me 3 times. Then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. No words are recorded in that moment. Jesus did not call out across the courtyard. He did not expose Peter before everyone. He did not say, "I warned you." He did not crush him with public shame. He simply looked at him. But that look held more truth than 1,000 sentences. Peter saw the face of the one he had denied, the one standing bound because of love, the one accused by lies, yet still faithful. the one Peter had promised to follow unto death, the one who had known Peter's weakness before Peter knew it himself. And in that look, Peter was seen completely. Not only his failure, his love too, his fear, his boast, his weakness, his future. The look of Jesus did not excuse the denial, but neither did it erase Peter. It revealed the wound without destroying the wounded man. It told the truth, but it was not the truth of hatred. It was the truth of holy love, the kind of truth that breaks open the heart so grace can one day enter. Peter went out and wept bitterly, away from the fire, away from the questions, away from the crowd. He carried his words with him into the dark, and they followed like echoes. I do not know him. I do not know the man. I do not know him. The mouth that had once confessed Christ had now denied him. The disciple who had promised death had been undone by fear, and the tears came, not shallow tears, not tears meant to be seen, but the bitter weeping of a man who had discovered the truth about himself and could not escape it. Perhaps this is where Peter becomes painfully close to every human heart, not in his courage, but in his collapse, not in his bold promise, but in his bitter tears. Many people know what it feels like to remember words with sorrow, words spoken in fear, words spoken in anger, words spoken to protect oneself, words that denied love, wounded trust, betrayed conviction, or abandoned someone who needed faithfulness. And yet, Peter's tears were not the end of his story. This matters more than the courtyard knew, because Jesus had already prayed for him. Before Peter denied, Jesus had said that Satan desired to sift him like wheat, but he had prayed that Peter's faith would not fail completely. And when Peter turned back, he was to strengthen his brothers. The failure was terrible, but it was not final. The words were grievous, but they would not be the last words over Peter's life. For now, though, Peter could not yet see the shore of restoration. He could not yet smell the charcoal fire beside the Sea of Galilee. He could not yet hear the risen Christ ask, "Do you love me?" All he could hear was the rooster. All he could feel was shame. All he could remember was the look. Inside, Jesus continued forward into suffering. Outside, Peter disappeared into the night, carrying the weight of his own words. And while Peter wept beneath the sorrow of denial, Jesus was led toward another judgment hall, where truth would stand before power and refuse to shout. Morning came, but it did not bring mercy. The first light of day entered Jerusalem with a pale, quiet beauty, touching the stones of the city, the temple courts, the rooftops, and the Roman halls, where power dressed itself in order. But beneath that morning light, men were leading Jesus from one judgment to another. The night had been full of false witnesses, denial, mockery, and sorrow. Now the city was waking, and the innocent one was being brought before the authority of Rome. Pilate's hall stood with the cold confidence of empire. Stone pillars rose in the early light. Soldiers moved with practiced indifference. The air carried the weight of politics, religion, fear, and a crowd already being stirred toward violence. Jesus stood there bound, bruised, and calm, while men who could not agree on truth agreed on one thing. They wanted him condemned. Pilate looked at him and saw a prisoner unlike others. There was no frantic pleading in Jesus, no panic in his eyes, no desperate attempt to gather sympathy. He did not throw accusations back at his accusers. He did not try to bargain for his life. He did not shrink, and he did not rage. He stood before earthly power with the stillness of one whose life was already surrendered to the Father. "Are you the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked. Jesus answered, but not like a man trying to survive. He answered with truth that opened the deeper question beneath the question. "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Even now, Jesus was not controlled by the courtroom. He was not trapped inside Pilate's categories. He spoke in a way that made power examine itself. Pilate moved between curiosity and irritation. He was not a shepherd seeking truth for the sake of his soul. He was a governor trying to manage a dangerous morning. The religious leaders wanted a sentence. The crowd was restless. The prisoner before him did not behave like a criminal. And yet, political convenience has often feared truth more than guilt. Jesus told him, "My kingdom is not of this world." It was not a kingdom defended by swords in the garden. It was not a kingdom built on manipulation, noise, force, or fear. If his kingdom had been of this world, his servants would have fought. But Jesus had already stopped Peter's sword. He had already healed the wounded servant. He had already shown that the throne he carried was not protected by violence. Pilate heard the word king and pressed further. "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." There, before Roman judgment, Jesus spoke the purpose of his voice. He had come to bear witness to the truth, not to win arguments for pride, not to shout over crowds, not to save his reputation by panic, not to crush his enemies with superior words. His voice belonged to truth, and truth belonged to the Father. Pilate asked, "What is truth?" The question remained in the air like a door he did not know how to open. Then Pilate went out again and told the crowd he found no guilt in him. But the crowd did not want innocence. They wanted crucifixion. Voices multiplied. Accusations grew louder. Their insistence became a storm pressing against the walls. Pilate had the authority to release Jesus, but authority without courage becomes a servant of fear. Jesus was sent to Herod and mocked again, then brought back. A robe was placed on him. Soldiers treated his kingship as a joke. They did not know they were mocking the Lord of glory. They did not know that the one standing in silence before them had spoken stars into being. They did not know that the hands they bound had touched blind eyes and made them see. They did not know that the head they mocked would one day wear many crowns. And still, Jesus did not answer cruelty with cruelty. There is a strength in him that the world cannot explain. The world thinks strength must always defend itself loudly. It thinks innocence must always prove itself immediately. It thinks power must always answer insult with greater insult. But Jesus stood in a deeper strength. He knew who he was. He knew why he had come. He knew the Father had not lost sight of him. And because his identity was not being handed to the crowd could not take it from him. This is the quiet place where many wounded hearts ache. When you have been misunderstood, something inside wants to be believed. When you have been accused, something inside wants the room to finally see the truth. When people talk about you without knowing your heart, every part of you may want to speak until the story is corrected. And sometimes truth must be spoken. Sometimes silence would become cowardice. Sometimes love requires clarity. But there are other times when the hunger to be vindicated can become a chain. You can spend all your strength trying to convince people who have already chosen their version of you. Jesus did not live under that chain. He spoke when truth served the Father's will. He stayed silent when words would only feed the machinery of condemnation. He did not beg Pilate for approval. He did not try to make the crowd love him. He did not let the fear of being misunderstood pull him away from obedience. Truth stood quietly because truth did not need to become frantic in order to remain true. Pilate grew more uneasy. He asked where Jesus was from. Jesus gave him no answer. The silence frustrated him. "Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" he asked. Then Jesus spoke again calmly, with the majesty of heaven hidden beneath suffering. "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." What a word to speak before a man seated in judgment. Jesus did not deny Pilate's position, but he placed it beneath the sovereignty of God. Pilate's authority was real, but it was not ultimate. Rome was powerful, but not eternal. The crowd was loud, but not sovereign. The cross was near, but not outside the Father's plan. Pilate tried to release him, but the voices rose. The leaders pressed the political threat. The crowd chose Barabbas. The innocent was rejected, and the guilty was released. In that exchange, the gospel was already being pictured before anyone understood it. The sinless one would take the place of the condemned. The bound one would bring freedom. The rejected one would open the way home. At last, Pilate washed his hands before the crowd, as if water could cleanse a fearful decision. But guilt is not removed by ceremony when the heart has surrendered justice to convenience. Jesus was handed over to be crucified. The hall of judgment began to empty. The crowd's roar moved toward Golgotha. Soldiers took Jesus away. The morning that should have brought light now carried the shadow of the cross. And yet, even here, truth had not been defeated. It had simply chosen the road of redemption. Jesus had stayed silent before false accusation. He had spoken when truth required witness. He had refused to shout for approval. He had refused to let fear govern his tongue. And now, the one who had restrained his voice before Pilate would soon speak from the cross. Not words of revenge, but words that would change eternity. They led him to Golgotha, the place of the skull, where the city seemed to empty its fear and hatred onto a hill outside its walls. The morning had already been heavy with judgment, but now the sky itself seemed to grow solemn. The road to the cross was not only a road of suffering, it was the place where every cruel word, every false accusation, every cowardly silence, every speech born of fear and pride, every wound of the human tongue was being carried by the Word made flesh. Jesus had stood silent before those who lied about him. He had spoken truth before power, without begging to be believed. Now he came to the place where his words would not defend himself, but save others. Around him, voices continued. Some mocked, some gambled, some watched with curiosity, some grieved from a distance because they could not bear to come closer. The soldiers did what soldiers were ordered to do. The rulers spoke as if the cross proved they had been right all along. The crowd moved in waves of misunderstanding, not knowing that the one lifted before them was not losing the kingdom, but opening it, and near the cross stood those whose hearts were breaking in silence. Mary, his mother, was there. John was there. Other faithful women stood close enough to suffer with him, yet powerless to stop what was unfolding. They had heard his voice teach beside the sea. They had heard him speak blessing over the poor in spirit. They had heard him call the weary to himself. They had heard him command storms, forgive sins, and call the dead from tombs. Now they heard his breath beneath the weight of the cross, and the sound of it must have felt like the whole world grieving. There are moments when love can do nothing but remain. Mary could not remove the nails. John could not silence the crowd. The women could not persuade Rome, but they could stand near. Sometimes the holiest love in a place of sorrow is not a speech. It is presence. It is staying when everything in the heart wants to run from the pain. It is bearing witness to the one who suffers and refusing to let them be alone. Then Jesus spoke, not to curse those beneath him, not to expose everyone who had lied, not to call down judgment with the authority that belonged to him. His first words from the cross rose toward the Father like mercy breaking through the darkest hour. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The words did not make the evil small. They did not pretend the injustice was harmless. They did not deny the betrayal, the cruelty, the cowardice, or the sin. Forgiveness from the cross was not weakness. It was the power of holy love, refusing to let hatred have the final word. Jesus did not speak because pain had made him bitter. He spoke because the Father's heart was still flowing through him, even there. For every person who has ever been wounded by words, those words from the cross are not easy. Forgiveness may feel impossible when the memory still burns. It may feel unfair when no apology has come, when the truth has never been acknowledged, when the person who wounded you walked away as if nothing happened. Jesus does not make forgiveness shallow. He shows its cost. He shows that forgiveness is not denial. It is placing justice into the hands of the Father and refusing to become a prisoner of the wound. The crowd did not understand. The rulers sneered. The soldiers continued their work. But mercy had been spoken into the air, and the air would never be the same. Beside Jesus, two criminals hung under the same darkening sky. One joined the mockery, throwing desperate words from his own suffering. Pain can make a person hard. It can turn even a dying man's mouth into a weapon. But the other man saw something. Maybe he saw innocence. Maybe he heard forgiveness and recognized a kingdom not of this world. Maybe the grace of God opened his heart at the very edge of death. He rebuked the mockery and turned his face toward Jesus with a prayer as small as a breath and as large as eternity. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He had no long record of service to present, no time to repair everything, no opportunity to rebuild a life. He had only one trembling request: "Remember me." And Jesus answered him, not with suspicion, not with delay, not with a list of what was too late, but with a promise. "Today you will be with me in paradise." There, from the cross, Jesus showed when words must be spoken. Speak when hope is dying beside you. Speak when a soul needs mercy more than explanation. Speak when someone feels it is too late to be remembered by God. Speak words that open a door toward grace. The thief asked to be remembered someday. Jesus promised him paradise today. Then Jesus looked down and saw his mother. In his suffering, he did not forget her sorrow. He saw Mary standing there, the woman who had carried him, held him, searched for him, followed him, and now watched the sword of grief pierce her soul. He saw John near her, and with tenderness that did not disappear under agony, he said, "Woman, behold your son." Then to the disciple, "Behold your mother." Even from the cross, his words created family, care, and shelter. He did not use his final strength for self-defense. He used it to forgive enemies, save the repentant, and care for the grieving. This is the voice of Christ. This is speech healed by perfect love. Words shaped not by panic, not by pride, not by the need to be vindicated, but by the holy purpose of the Father. The hill grew darker, the sky changed, the earth seemed to hold its breath. The voices below could not understand that the greatest sermon ever spoken was not only in the words Jesus said, but in the words he refused to say. He did not say, "You will pay for this." He did not say, "Look what you have done to me." He did not say, "I was right and you were wrong." He entrusted himself to the Father, and from that surrender came words that still heal the world. At last, after the hours of suffering, after the darkness, after the weight of sin and sorrow beyond human understanding, Jesus spoke again. "It is finished," not "I am finished." It is finished. The work was complete. The debt was answered. The promise was fulfilled. The Lamb had given himself. The silence before accusers, the words of forgiveness from the cross, the obedience in the garden, the suffering beneath the sky, all of it had moved toward this holy declaration. It was not the cry of defeat. It was the announcement that love had finished what sin could never undo. Then Jesus gave up his spirit. The earth trembled. The rocks split. The curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom, as though heaven itself had opened the way into the presence of God. A Roman centurion, standing near enough to see what others had mocked, felt the weight of revelation and said, "Truly this was the Son of God." But for those who loved him, the world must have felt emptied of breath. The body of Jesus was taken down with reverence. Joseph of Arimathea, who had been a disciple in secret, stepped forward with courage after the crucifixion. Nicodemus came too, carrying costly spices. They wrapped the body of Jesus and placed him in a new tomb cut into stone. A great stone was rolled against the entrance. Evening gathered over the garden. The Sabbath approached, and then came silence, the silence of the tomb. It was unlike the silence before false accusers. It was unlike the silence of prayer in Gethsemane. It was unlike the silence between Peter's denial and his tears. This silence felt final to those who could only see with human eyes. The voice that had called Lazarus from the grave was now sealed inside a grave. The hands that had touched the sick were still. The feet that had walked on water were wrapped. The mouth that had spoken forgiveness was quiet. Saturday settled over Jerusalem like a heavy veil. The disciples hid in grief and fear. Peter carried the memory of the rooster and the look of Jesus. Mary carried a sorrow no mother should have to bear. The women waited because love still wanted to honor him, even when hope seemed buried. The city returned to its rhythms, but for those who had followed Jesus, nothing felt ordinary. The world had become a question too painful to ask. What do you do when God seems silent after the thing you feared has happened? What do you do when the prayer was not answered the way you hoped, when the door closed, when the person left, when the diagnosis came, when the relationship broke, when the apology never arrived, when the dream was sealed behind a stone? There are Saturdays in the life of the soul, days after loss and before understanding, days when faith does not know what to say, days when all the words have been spent and the only thing left is waiting. The tomb teaches us that the silence of God is not the absence of God. It teaches us that the deepest work of heaven can be hidden behind stone. It teaches us that when human voices fall quiet, God may still be doing what no eye can see. The disciples did not know resurrection was approaching. They had heard Jesus speak of it, but grief has a way of making promises feel distant. Pain can cover memory. Fear can dull hope. And Peter, especially, must have felt as though his own failure had sealed something inside him, too. The tomb held the body of Jesus, but Peter's heart held the words he wished he had never spoken. I do not know him. Those words had become his own stone. But heaven was not finished. Beneath the stillness, the victory of God was not sleeping. The silence was not empty. The grave was not a prison strong enough to hold the author of life. The world had spoken condemnation. Jesus had spoken, "It is finished." Now the Father would speak through resurrection. Before dawn, before the city understood, before Peter knew grace would come looking for him, before the disciples unlocked their doors, God was already turning the story. And when the first day of the week began to break, the garden that had held a tomb began to glow with the quiet edge of morning. The stone would not remain where sorrow left it. Death would not keep what love had redeemed. Silence would not be the last sound. Mary Magdalene came early, while it was still dark. She came not expecting a miracle, but carrying devotion. Some love keeps walking even when it does not know what hope remains. She came to the tomb with the ache of someone who still wanted to be near Jesus, even if all she could do was mourn. The air was cool, the garden was dim, the world was between night and morning, that fragile hour when shadows still hold the ground, but light has begun its slow approach. And then she saw the stone had been taken away. Her heart must have ceased. The grief of death was terrible enough. Now even the place of his body seemed disturbed. She ran to Peter and John with the message that someone had taken the Lord out of the tomb, and they did not know where they had laid him. Peter and John ran. They saw the linen cloths lying there, the face cloth folded separately. The tomb was empty, but understanding had not fully risen in them. John believed, yet the fullness of what had happened was still unfolding. The disciples returned to their homes, but Mary stayed. She stood outside the tomb weeping. That detail is tender. Others came and went. Mary remained. Her tears were not rushed by heaven. The resurrection had already happened, but her heart had not yet received it. The miracle was real before she understood it. The victory was complete before her grief could feel it. Jesus was alive while Mary was still crying. This is how gentle God is with the wounded. He does not despise the tears that continue after. He has already begun the miracle. He does not shame the heart for needing time to recognize hope. Mary wept in front of an empty tomb, and heaven did not mock her for misunderstanding. Angels spoke to her. "Woman, why are you weeping?" she answered with the sorrow she knew. "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Then she turned and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know it was Jesus. Grief can do that. It can stand near the answer and still feel alone. It can look at hope and mistake it for another stranger. It can hear a voice and not recognize the one the heart is longing for. Mary thought he was the gardener. Through tears, through shock, through sorrow, her eyes could not yet see what love had already done. Jesus asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" The risen Christ began not with a command, not with a rebuke, not with a grand declaration to the world, but with a question tender enough to meet her grief. He did not rush past her tears to prove the miracle. He came near and let the question open her heart. She said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Even in her sorrow, she wanted to carry what she could. Love sometimes tries to carry more than it has strength to bear. Mary would have carried his body if she could. She would have done one last act of devotion. She did not know she was speaking to the living Lord. Then Jesus said one word, Mary, her name, not an argument, not an explanation, not a sermon. One word spoken by the voice she knew broke through the fog of grief. The shepherd called his sheep by name, and the sheep knew his voice. In that instant the garden changed. The stranger was the Savior. The grief-stricken morning became resurrection morning. The tomb was not the end. The silence had been broken by a name. "Rabboni," she cried, "Teacher." The voice she thought had been silenced forever was speaking to her personally. Before the risen Christ sent a message to the disciples, before the news spread, before Peter was restored, he met a weeping woman in a garden and called her by name. This is the beauty of the resurrection. It is cosmic enough to shake death itself, yet personal enough to speak to one broken heart. Jesus did not rise only as a doctrine to be defended. He rose as the living Lord who knows his people. He knows the names of those who stand outside tombs. He knows the names of those who have been crying too long. He knows the names of those who feel forgotten, unseen, and left behind by joy. He knows the name beneath the grief, beneath the regret, beneath the fear, beneath the words that wounded and the words that failed. Mary wanted to hold him, but Jesus told her not to cling to him, for he had not yet ascended to the Father. Then he gave her a message. She was to go to his brothers and say, "I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God," his brothers. Not deserters, not cowards, not failures, brothers. The resurrection changed the language. The disciples who had run, hidden, doubted, and failed were still being called brothers by the risen Christ. Peter, who had denied him, was included in that word. The men behind fear would soon hear a message carried by Mary. "I have seen the Lord." Mary came to them with the first light of resurrection in her voice. She who had wept outside the tomb became a witness. She who thought the Lord had been taken became the first to announce that he was alive. The one who stayed in sorrow was given words of hope. The divine turning point had begun. The silence of the tomb had become the speech of resurrection. The Savior who stayed silent before false accusers now spoke a name that healed grief. The one who said, "It is finished," now began the new creation by calling his own into hope. Mary carried the news through trembling joy, but behind locked doors, the disciples still needed words that could calm fear. Mary carried the news through trembling joy, but behind locked doors, the disciples still needed words that could calm fear. The room where they gathered did not feel like a place of victory. It felt like a shelter for frightened men who did not yet know how to live in a world where the tomb was empty. The doors were shut because fear had taught their hands to lock what their hearts could not understand. Outside were the same streets that had carried Jesus toward the cross. Outside were the voices of leaders who had condemned him. Outside was the memory of soldiers, crowds, accusations, and the awful sound of Rome finishing what hatred had demanded. Inside were the disciples, alive but shaken, breathing but afraid, hearing impossible reports and not yet able to let hope stand fully upright. They had heard from Mary. She had seen the Lord. She had spoken the words no grieving heart could have invented by itself. But fear is not always healed the moment good news arrives. Sometimes the heart receives truth slowly, like a dark room learning to receive morning. The disciples were still behind the door. Peter was there too, carrying a wound that no locked door could keep out. He had not only lost Jesus, he had denied him. He had not only watched the Master suffer, he had failed him in the hour when loyalty mattered most. The others had their own fears, their own shame, their own confusion. They had scattered when he was taken. They had hidden while he died. They were together, but each man carried a private silence. Then Jesus came and stood among them. No door opened, no guard announced him, no human hand made way for him. The risen Christ entered the room that fear had sealed, and suddenly the place of hiding became a place of visitation. The same Jesus who had been crucified now stood alive in the midst of those who had abandoned him. He did not begin by demanding an explanation. He did not ask why they had run. He did not speak first to their failure. He spoke to their fear. "Peace be with you." Those words entered the room like light entering a tomb. Peace. Not because they had been brave, not because they had understood everything, not because their record was clean. Peace because he was alive. Peace because the cross had not ended in defeat. Peace because his mercy had come through locked doors. Peace because the one they had lost was standing in front of them with wounds that were no longer signs of defeat, but proof of love. He showed them his hands and his side. The wounds remained, but they did not rule him. This is a holy mystery. The risen Jesus did not erase the marks of suffering as if they had never happened. He carried them transformed. The wounds that once looked like shame had become testimony. The scars that once seemed to say hatred had won, now declared that love had conquered. And when the disciples saw the Lord, joy began to rise where fear had been sitting. Again he said, "Peace be with you." He said it more than once because frightened hearts often need peace repeated. Shame needs to hear mercy more than one time. Grief needs truth spoken again. The first word of the risen Christ to the gathered disciples was not a lecture, but a gift. He breathed on them and spoke of the Holy Spirit. The room that had been closed by fear was becoming the beginning of mission. But Jesus gave peace before he sent them. He restored the heart before asking for the voice. He knew they could not speak for him in the world if they had not first received his peace within themselves. Thomas was not with them when Jesus came, and when the others told him they had seen the Lord, he could not enter their joy. He wanted more than a report. He wanted to see. He wanted to touch the wounds. There was sorrow beneath his doubt, perhaps the sorrow of a man afraid to hope and be broken again. Some hearts become cautious after grief. They do not reject love because they hate it. They resist hope because they fear another disappointment. 8 days later, the disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. The doors were shut, but Jesus came again. Mercy returned to a locked room. Peace spoke again into the fear. "Peace be with you." Then Jesus turned toward Thomas. He did not mock him. He did not shame him before the others. He invited him close. "Put your finger here and see my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Jesus answered doubt not with cruelty, but with wounds. He met Thomas at the place where faith had trembled, and Thomas, standing before the risen Lord, gave one of the clearest confessions in all the story. "My Lord and my God." The room had changed. It was still made of walls and doors, but it no longer belonged to fear. Jesus had entered. Peace had been spoken. Doubt had been met. Wounds had become witness. But one disciple still carried a deeper ache. Peter had heard peace. Peter had seen Jesus alive. Peter had been included among the brothers. Yet the fire in the courtyard still burned in his memory. His denial still had a voice inside him. Peace had entered the room, but Peter's own heart still needed a conversation by another fire. And so the story moved back to Galilee. The sea was quiet in the early hours, wide and familiar beneath the changing sky. Peter had returned to fishing as if his hands were trying to remember who he had been before everything broke open. The boat rocked under him. The nets moved through dark water. Several of the disciples were with him, casting and pulling, waiting and laboring through the night. But they caught nothing. There is a certain loneliness in empty nets. It is the weariness of effort without fruit, motion without answer, old skill without success. Peter knew these waters. He knew the sound of rope against wood, the feel of wet nets against his hands, the patience of fishermen under stars. But this night gave him nothing. Perhaps that emptiness matched something inside him. He had failed as a disciple. Now even the sea seemed silent. As morning began to break, a figure stood on the shore. The disciples did not yet know it was Jesus. The risen Lord stood at the edge of ordinary life, where tired men were returning from a fruitless night. He called to them, asking if they had any fish. They answered no. Then he told them to cast the net on the right side of the boat, and they would find some. They obeyed, and the water came alive. The net filled so heavily they could not haul it in. In that moment, memory must have stirred. Another day, another miraculous catch, another moment when Jesus had called fishermen into something greater than fish. John understood first. It is the Lord. When Peter heard that it was the Lord, he threw himself into the sea. There is something beautiful in that urgency. The man who had once followed at a distance now plunged toward Jesus through the water. Shame had not killed his love. Failure had not erased his longing. He did not wait for the boat to drift in. He did not sit back calculating whether he deserved to come near. Love moved before shame could stop it. Peter went toward the shore, toward the one he had denied and still loved. When they came to land, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish laid on it, and bread. A charcoal fire. The detail is quiet, but it carries deep tenderness. Peter's denial had happened near a fire. His restoration would happen near a fire too. Jesus did not avoid the memory. He redeemed it. He brought Peter back to a place that resembled a wound, not to reopen it cruelly, but to heal it truthfully. The same sense of smoke, warmth, morning chill, and waiting presence now surrounded not fear, but grace. Jesus had prepared breakfast. The risen Lord, conqueror of death, stood on the shore, making a meal for men who had failed him. This is the humility of divine love. He did not appear with thunder to crush them. He did not summon them to a court to explain themselves. He fed them, bread and fish, warmth after a cold night, provision after empty nets, fellowship after fear. He said, "Come and have breakfast." No one dared ask who he was. They knew Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. The meal was simple, but everything in it was mercy. The hands that had been nailed now served breakfast. The one they had abandoned now invited them to eat. Grace was not an idea on that shore. It was bread in wounded hands. After they had eaten, Jesus turned to Peter. The sea moved softly behind them. The fire burned between memory and mercy. The morning light settled over Galilee like a new beginning. Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He called him Simon, not because Peter's new name was forgotten, but because Jesus was reaching into the man beneath the promise, beneath the boast, beneath the failure. Peter had once claimed a loyalty greater than others. Now Jesus asked not about strength, not about courage, not about explanations, not about the courtyard, not about why he had denied him. He asked about love. "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know that I love you." Jesus answered, "Feed my lambs." Again he asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." A third time Jesus asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Now the question reached the deepest place. 3 times Peter had denied. 3 times Jesus asked, not to humiliate him, but to heal him. Not to make him relive shame without hope, but to let love speak where fear had spoken before. Peter was grieved because the question came a 3rd time. Perhaps every denial echoed in him. Perhaps the rooster's cry returned. Perhaps he felt again the terrible ache of his own words. But this time he did not boast. He did not say he was stronger than the others. He did not make a grand promise from untested confidence. He placed himself in the knowledge of Jesus. "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." It was not the speech of pride anymore. It was the speech of a humbled man. Broken self-confidence had become honest dependence. Peter no longer offered Jesus the strength of a man who did not know his weakness. He offered love from a heart that had been seen, failed, forgiven, and called again. Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." There it was, calling restored. Not because Peter had never failed, not because the denial did not matter, not because words were unimportant. Calling restored because grace was greater than failure, and Jesus knew how to heal a voice that shame had nearly silenced. Peter had used words to deny. Jesus used words to restore. Peter had spoken from fear beside a fire. Jesus spoke from love beside a fire. Peter had once said, "I do not know him." Now he said, "Lord, you know everything." And in that confession he returned not to the strength of his own claims, but to the mercy of being fully known and still loved. Jesus did not simply forgive Peter privately and leave him without purpose. He entrusted people to him, lambs, sheep, souls. The man whose mouth had failed would one day use that same mouth to proclaim Christ with power, humility, and tears. But first, his voice had to be healed by love. The shore of Galilee became a sanctuary of restoration. The waves moved gently. The fire crackled low. The net full of fish lay nearby like a sign that fruitfulness was still possible. The risen Jesus stood with a man who had fallen, and instead of ending his story, he gave him a commission. This is what changed after God moved. Locked rooms became places of peace. Doubt became confession. Empty nets became abundance. A fire of shame became a fire of restoration. A disciple broken by his own words became a shepherd called to feed the flock of Christ. And the story that began with painful words now moved toward a healed voice. Peter came to the shore with the memory of denial, but he left with a calling. He came carrying the sentence, "I do not know him," but he left having said, "Lord, you know everything." He came from a night of failure, but he walked into a morning of mercy. And from that mercy, the Lord would teach every wounded believer that the goal is not simply to speak less or speak louder, but to speak from a heart that has been healed. A healed voice is not born in pride. It is born near the cross, where Jesus forgives enemies. It is born near the empty tomb, where Jesus calls the grieving by name. It is born behind locked doors, where Jesus speaks peace before mission. It is born beside the sea, where the Savior restores the one who failed and gives him work to do again. There are words that wounded you, and God knows them. He knows the sentence that still echoes. He knows the accusation that changed how you saw yourself. He knows the criticism that settled into your heart like a shadow. He knows the family words, the church words, the marriage words, the friend words, the words spoken in anger, and the words never spoken when you needed comfort. He also knows the words you regret. He knows the moment fear spoke through you. He knows the apology you wish you had given sooner. He knows the person you hurt, the relationship you miss, the conversation you replay when the world is quiet. But Jesus is not afraid of your history with words. He entered a world of twisted speech and false witness. He stood silent when accusation wanted to make him react. He spoke truth when truth needed to be revealed. He forgave from the cross when hatred surrounded him. He gave hope to a dying man who had nothing left but a request. He cared for his mother in the hour of his suffering. He declared redemption complete. He broke the silence of grief by calling Mary's name. He stepped into locked rooms with peace. He met doubt with wounded hands. He restored Peter with questions of love. And now through that story, he teaches the soul a better way. Stay silent when your words would only feed pride. Stay silent when the room is not seeking truth, but a weapon. Stay silent when anger is asking to borrow your voice. Stay silent when God is inviting you to trust Him with your reputation. Stay silent when pain has not yet been healed enough to speak gently. Stay silent when another sentence would only deepen the wound. Stay silent when obedience matters more than being understood. But speak when love requires courage. Speak when truth protects the vulnerable. Speak when forgiveness can begin to break a chain. Speak when someone beside you needs hope before it is too late. Speak when God gives you a word that carries life instead of poison. Speak when silence would only serve fear. Speak when Christ has healed your voice enough to make it an instrument of mercy. The difference is not always easy. The heart will need prayer. The tongue will need grace. The memory will need healing. There will be moments when you want to defend yourself, and the Spirit may whisper, "Be still." There will be moments when you want to disappear, and the Spirit may whisper, "Speak the truth in love." But you are not left to learn this alone. Jesus has walked the path before you. He has given you His Spirit. He has shown you that silence can be holy, and speech can be healing when both are surrendered to the Father. The words that wounded, you do not have the final authority over your life. The words you regret do not have the final authority either. The final word belongs to Jesus, the Word made flesh, crucified and risen, faithful and near. Peter's final story was not denial. Mary's final story was not weeping. Thomas's final story was not doubt. The disciples' final story was not fear behind locked doors. Christ came to each of them, and what He spoke changed what shame had written. He is still doing that. He is still entering locked rooms, still calling names in gardens of grief, still speaking peace to fear, still preparing breakfast for the weary, still asking wounded hearts the question that heals deeper than accusation ever could. Do you love me? And if your answer is small, trembling, and honest, that is enough to begin. Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. From there, He can restore what fear damaged. He can forgive what shame repeats. He can teach your silence to rest in trust, and your words to carry grace. He can make your voice steady without making it harsh, brave without making it cruel, gentle without making it afraid. The sun rose higher over Galilee, and Peter stood in the light of a mercy he had not earned, but would spend the rest of his life proclaiming. The sea that had watched his return to old nets now watched his return to calling. The fire that could have reminded him only of failure now became a sign that Jesus can meet a person at the exact place of shame and make it holy ground. And this is the comfort that remains. No word of man is stronger than the word of God. No accusation is stronger than the blood of Christ. No regret is stronger than His restoring love. No silence is empty when He is near. No wounded voice is beyond His healing. May the Lord heal the words that wounded you, forgive the words you regret, and teach your voice to carry the peace of Christ, silent when love requires patience, brave when truth must be spoken, and gentle because the faithful Savior is still with you.